I survived the city blackout, and it changed my life in ways the pay stub never could. I took the night shift because the money was better than anything I could get day shifting at a cafe, and because the building needed someone who didn't ask questions. The superintendent job, night technician really, meant you were the adult left alone with the building's heartbeat. The generator room, the rooftop floodlights, the console that blinked when the street didn't. I liked having a job that had rules. Rules are the thing that keeps you from getting eaten by whatever city-level weirdness hides in plain sight. At least, that's how I justified it to myself the first couple of months. The tower was older than the city's latest sheen. 14 floors of apartments stacked like an afterthought on a concrete spine, retail on the ground, and my little kingdom below the water table. The plant room with the 2 diesel backups, the battery bank, and a wall of monitors that fed me the building's posture, temperature curves, load graphs, pressure readings from the chilled water loop. There was a smell that lived in that room in summer, a mixture of diesel, hot metal, and something like ozone after a thunderstorm. The vibration from the generator felt like a living thing when it warmed up. You could read a week in its hum. I like routine. I like my palms to fit the cast-iron wheel of the manual transfer switch. I like the tick of the analog clock above the service door. I like that the flashing LEDs on the scatter monitor never surprise you when you know how they blink. Routine keeps monsters away, so I kept my routine. Rule 1. Walk the building every hour. Personally check the hub-lit corridors, the stairwell lights, the rooftop access hatch. Logs lie. They anonymize timestamps and put blame in the wrong box, but your boots on the concrete tell the truth. The rule came from a binder called Operations, Night Shift. It was laminated and coffee-stained and had been stapled back together 3 times. Whoever made it had handwriting that knew how to be neat in emergency. On the first page, under a list of contacts and a hand-drawn diagram of the power feed, someone had written in exact block letters, "Beware the tangle." There was no explanation. I assumed it was a vandalism prank until Joey told me not to laugh. Joey was the kind of person who believed in patterns the way others believe in weather reports. He was a contractor's kid who had taken the building's side room one winter and made it into a map room, folding city maps thumbtacked to corkboard, printouts of outage reports, red string connecting dots he said formed a language. He kept notebooks with dense shorthand and little diagrams of streets that looked like something a cartographer would do drunk. Joey loved the smell of old paper. He loved the idea that someone in the past had seen the same thing and left a breadcrumb.
"Pattern," he'd say, tapping a yellowing newspaper clipping with a pen that had been chewed to the nub. "Not a ghost, a pattern. You can make sense out of patterns." I preferred graphs. Give me a multi-decade load profile and a trending function, and I could predict 2/3 of what would happen in the plant room. Joey said predicting was the same as seeing. I said predicting doesn't mean you can stop what wants to happen. We had jokes about hope. We had a ritual handshake that was half mock serious, half superstition. He was loud in the way that made other people comfortable. His voice filled the roof better than any of the downturned floodlights. He called the binder a manual, the way a priest might call a prayer book. He underlined "Beware the tangle" and read that phrase like a promise. The first night I met him properly, after I'd signed a bunch of paperwork and been shown the emergency generator's start sequence, he told me about the city's dead trains. Not with a straight face. He tapped one of his maps and pointed to a stretch of subterranean tracks where the transit authority had buried a line in the 50s, rerouted it in the 70s, and forgotten about it in the 90s. You ever see 'em? The cars? They move like someone's driving from the inside of a memory. I hadn't. I didn't want to. I had faith in the lights. Lights are the practical thing. Light makes ledger of reality. Keep the lights on long enough and every strange scribble in the ledger fades. We ran the building like a small ship with its own rules. The residents were ghosts we passed by in morning claims and evening complaints. The property managers called during the day asking for forms. Night was ours. There was a quiet pride to being the ones who kept the lights on when the other towers flickered like sleepwalkers. We also had the city's grid on a monitor, limited but sufficient. We watched a web of feeds, our building's incoming service, transformer statuses, inbound utility alerts that occasionally read like portent. The SCADA. The control center used by the utility had an API feed we could subscribe to. Most nights it was a boring stream of numbers. If the utility sent an alert, our console would chirp. If we were lucky, the chirp would mean a planned outage. A line crew would cut a breaker, clamp a splice, and the world would resume. On the night the lights died across the whole city, the chirp was an animal sound. It kept going, and then stopped. It started like a rumor. I was making the hourly rounds. The corridors were warm and smelled of overnight cooking, something sweet and burnt that seeped up through floor vents. The rooftop was a strip of cold under the stars, the generator's exhaust smoke twisting into the precise, familiar pattern that meant the machine was happy. I checked the transfer switch with my flashlight and hummed to myself to count the seconds. Joey called from the service room at 23:49.
"You should look at the grid feed," he said. "We just saw 3 feeders drop in sequence." "Feeder trip?" I asked, because technical consolation makes the world less scary. It's a language of control. He laughed. "That's what I thought, but then every feeder chimed. It's like someone closed a fist on the whole city." "I'll review the logs," I said. "If it's the utility, they'll flag it. Call the contractor line." We had a contractor who came out for emergency generator parts and emergency diesel drums. He'd been called in my first week to swap a belt and told me at the time, offhand, that people always underappreciate night people until the lights go. He said it like a coda. I figured we'd be calling him. Rule 2. Never trust the first official explanation. You are the one who has to stay put until a clear plan is on paper. Paper outlives panic. I told myself that as I stayed in the plant room and let the generator run its cycles. In my head, the city was a machine. Machines break. Machines are fixed. When the feed hiccuped, the diesel spun up like a loyal animal. The hallway lights stayed. The emergency lights took over. The console's graph showed me the feed dropping and the battery bank shouldering load, and something in my chest eased. And then the noise started. At first, it was negligible. An odd, low-frequency thrum beneath the generator hum, like a far-off subway train that refused to behave. My chest picked up the vibration, not my ears. Something in the concrete was singing away out of tune. It felt like standing too close to a ship's engine. I walked the stairwell to check for residences. The fire stairs had the same throb. The building's air ducts related like a secret. "Transformer hum?" I suggested, because explanations keep panic manageable. Joey's hand hovered over the map. "Feels deeper," he said, "under the tunnel routes, somewhere where the city forgot to lay down rules." We ran through checklists, emergency generator status, manual switches, fuel levels. The generator's diesel smelled like burnt oil and something sweet that shouldn't be in an engine bay, like a tarry perfume. My back of the throat tightened. We both paused, and for a second the building existed only in the two of us and that humming. When the city went dark, it was not a polite blackout. It was an all-voices hush, the kind of dark that doesn't let you pretend your lights will come back in a minute. 1 microsecond, the grid was feeding. The next, the web that had kept the skyline stitched together evaporated. Our rooftop floodlights blinked, takes a breath, and the city exhaled light in a way that wasn't supposed to happen. Buildings went from soft halos to holes. Alleyways swallowed themselves. Street signs stopped announcing themselves. The hum beneath us deepened, like the rumble of something turning over in its sleep. Inside our plant room, the diesel coughed, strained, and the transfer switch did what it could.
The single-screen SCADA lit up with alarms. Utility sprites on the interface, icons normally green, were all gray rectangles with question marks. Our radios buzzed with traffic from the municipal emergency channels. The utility's recorded voice on the inbound line said over and over, "We are investigating," which is both pointless and the only thing they were allowed to say. We were supposed to be ready for this. It's why the building had 2 diesel units and a manual start. It's why the manager had made me fill out the transfer protocol and memorize the contact list. In theory, with paperwork and diesel, nothing should have been an impossibility more frightening than the smell of burnt wiring. Theory has never been good at handling things that move under the city. At first, the blackout played out like a bureaucratic error. Crews mobilized, there's a feed, the utility says they'll reroute, we switch to auxiliary power, we open the resident message board to tell them to keep fridges closed and lights off. I made a checklist and checked it twice. Rule 3. Never answer a personal call during a blackout. If they sound like someone you miss, it's a lure. Joey read that aloud like a prayer. He had his pockets full of notebooks and a cracked phone that still picked up snippets of dispatch chatter. We started gathering reports from the building's tenants, mostly texts at first. Lights out on 9th. Is the city okay? Then came the calls. A woman screamed that her son was outside and couldn't find his way back. Someone else said their car wouldn't start. The building hummed with petty small disasters that in daylight were nothing. A burnt-out bulb, a stuck elevator. In the dark, they became immediate, loud, demanding. Then the other calls began. It started in the lobby PA. It was faint, like someone whispering on the other end of a bad line. The public address system in the building was old. It had a test button that made a loud, tinny cone. Whoever fed it had to be physically present in the office upstairs, which was empty. But the PA made a noise like an old voicemail that had decided to be a living thing. We heard a voice we knew. It wasn't exactly anyone. We live in a city that owns our faces, yet the cadence, the vowels, the way the voice fell at the end of a sentence was intimate. The voice sounded like my mother calling my name in the kitchen. It sounded like a landlord calling for rent. It sounded like someone who had left and learned to find you again. Joey flinched. "Don't go to the windows," he said. "Don't answer. Rule 3, Dave." "Rule 3 says don't answer personal calls," I said. The voice kept whispering and folded into itself like something trying on a human shape. My fingers tightened on the edge of the console. We kept the plant room lights on and let the rest of the building run on emergency circuits. Outside, somewhere under the city, something was moving. The CCTV feeds began to fail in rectangles.
A camera would keep a strip of image at the top and black everything else, as if someone had clipped a viewfinder at arbitrary intervals. When the images were partially live, we could see streets that looked abandoned but for shapes that moved with an odd grace. They weren't people in the cinematic sense. They were silhouettes in a brittle blue luminescence, like old photographs of people who had been overexposed to the same light. They moved along the avenues and across intersections without sound. Cars were there, at first, then not. Vehicles glided along and were gone when light came near them. Joey called them dead cars and drew one on his board with a pen, a little coffin with wheels. We pulled the archived incident reports in the afternoons between calls, the way you pull an old sweater out of a trunk because it smells like someone you used to know. The archives were paper-thin with time, yellowed incident reports from the utility, handwritten notations in the margins of old maintenance logs from different decades. There were logs from 1976 with entries about temporary loss of service affecting downtown sectors, and an after-action note that read like a shrug. Crew reported odd emissions from underground ducts. In 1992, a short, clipped line, multiple disappearances linked to mass audit, recommend further study. In 2010, someone in official scrawl had written, unexplained movement reported beneath city loop, no personnel harmed. The handwriting changed, but the chorus did not. Each report had the same rhythm. Power falter, sensors register something, people report familiar voices, some folks leave seeking aid, a small number don't return. The gaps between notes were ravines of time. Rule 4. If lights attract it, put the lights in your pocket. Cut rooftop power before you look. It sounded like superstition. It felt like survival. We tested Rule 4 by accident the first afternoon the phantom cars appeared. A patrol cruised by the base of the building in a city SUV. Its floodlights scanned the avenue and lit a shape into existence. A car, sunken low into the street, image perfect and motionless. The driver slowed to a stop and stared. The car didn't have a driver. The SUV's light hit it, and for a heartbeat the phantom car shimmered, like a mirage winking. Then the driver flicked his high beams on, and the car was gone as if the light had erased what had been drawn in shadow. The patrol's radio fizzed with disbelief. The driver muttered something about tricks of the eye. He never reported the thing formally. People, apparently, were generous with disbelieving. Joey didn't disbelieve. He had a pocket full of photocopies of entries from a transit authority binder stamped in the 70s. Disappearance during mass outage. Persons reported walking toward overhead train sounds. He traced the route with his finger and connected it to the city's old freight tunnels, the ones decommissioned during the freeway boom.
They move where the city forgot, he said. They follow the old arteries. We kept a list on a scrap of cardboard, observations, times, coordinates. We were not the utility. We could not reroute high-tension lines. We could cut rooftop floodlights and close stairwell doors and lock mechanical rooms. We could do petty things that mattered. That night, the city was a dim map. The outage was crawling with an awkward kind of beauty. Windows were islands of darkness and light. Then light went out entirely. The skyline became ragged. Some towers stayed on thanks to their private generators. Others were silhouetted like gravestones. The transit system gave us nothing. Trains crawled until they stopped, and the tunnels became throats. The low-frequency thrum under the streets deepened into something that had texture. It wasn't just noise, it was rhythm. It was a person breathing under concrete. When it moved, traffic lights in the distance twitched in sympathy. Microphones picked up a rattle that matched the pattern, like someone tapping Morse code through a pipe. We started getting calls that made your mouth go dry. A woman cried to say the city was singing to her. A man reported that his dead wife's voice told him where to meet her on the corner of Market and 3rd. A cluster of young men walked toward the subway entrance because a voice called their childhood nicknames. We saw them on camera, thin, trailing figures moving toward the vent grates, their phones held high as if light were a flag. The city did what it does with grief. It tried to explain. Utility spokespeople spoke of equipment failures, rampant vandalism, unprecedented load events. Policy people wrote formal memos that meant nothing in practice. The only thing that read as a pattern was the handwritten scrap that lived in the binder in our plant room. It contained a list. Someone had typed it years ago and then pencil scribbled over that typing until the words looked like the edges of a mouth. "Beware the tangle," the page said, and under that a single sentence in a different pen. "Turn the lights off. Do not go looking." We followed instructions the way sailors follow charted rock. You learn quick that there's wisdom in the old hand's shorthand. For me, the wisdom translated into dosed, careful action. Cut rooftop mains, remove the floodlights' fuses, close the stairwell doors, and post signs that told people elevators were out. We put a note in the lobby telling residents the building was on emergency power, that elevators were offline, that they should stay inside and keep their phones charged. The first of the phantom convoys rolled down 6th like a slow exhale. They were vehicles, at least in outline, sedans, a delivery van, a city bus. They glided without wind or sound, a procession lit from within by a thin blue glow that tasted like nostalgia. Their headlights were pale lanterns that did not emit heat.
They moved between stoplights as if the signals were part of a dream. Everyone on camera who watched them slowed and looked. A few residents went to the windows and leaned out. The convoy did not stop at the curb. It passed through intersections and dissolved at the far end of the block when the city's emergency vehicles shone a flood on them. We watched this on the monitor in the plant room. Joey swallowed and tapped the monitor with a damp finger. "If you hit them with light, they go," he said. "If you give them light, it's like cutting their seams." "I don't like the idea of turning lights off for people," I said, because in the ledger of the practical, light also meant safety. Turning it into a weapon felt like punishment for being alive. "Do you want to trust them?" Joey asked. "Do you want to trust a thing that makes your mother's voice? If it's a trap, that voice eats you a little at a time." We were not free of dilemma. A stairwell with a working light feels like lifeline when you're moving boxes down in the dark. The decision to cut floodlights up top felt like choosing between two wrongs: stay visible and be seen by whatever drifted through the blackout, or take the darkness and hope the rules held. We were not the only ones with notebooks. Later, when it was still early enough in the night to make salvageable sense of papers, we pulled a stack from a storage locker someone had left behind years ago. Thin, yellowed pages in a rain-stained envelope, stamped with old municipal seals. The first entry was dated 1974. It was a maintenance log from a building 2 blocks over that had been demolished and replaced by a newer office tower. The handwriting was small and precise, like a man's hands trying to keep his mouth from making a noise. "Outage at 0315, it read. "Noise under sidewalk. Resident called for husband. Husband exited building and did not return. Police report, missing. Crew heard song over manhole. Recommend blackout procedures." There were 3 other entries in the 1970s, each written by different hands, each closing with the same odd shorthand, BT. Not B.T, just the letters pressed together. Beware the tangle. I started to feel like a person reading chapter titles. In the 90s, there were typed memos, the kind city offices produce when someone upstairs thinks a problem should be archived away into silence. "Repeated anomalous ingress onto arterial conduits," one said. "No physical damage to infrastructure. Recommend containment and resident advisories." In the stack from 2010, there was a photocopy of a tentative policy draft. "If residents are called by voices during outages, instruct to remain in place and report." That draft had been crossed out with a different hand. "If they don't want to listen," someone had written nearby, "don't force them." It was not a policy, it was a shrug. You can spend a long time pretending documents are boring. Then you find the same set of words repeating across decades, and you realize the documents are a chorus. They are people whispering across time, trading pieces of instruction the way a fisherman hands another a line. Each pen stroke carried with it fear that had been waiting its turn. By the end of the first night, the city was a series of pockets, islands with their own music. In our building, the diesel kept the lights on the essential circuits. We lost the external sign, the rooftop floodlights, and the lobby's backlit advert. The tenants slept with candles and phone torches, and someone smuggled a concert out by the river so a crowd could keep watch. The emergency message boards filled with messages from people who had seen things that did not line up with rationality. Joey stayed up the whole night. He drew a map with pen and pencil and put dates next to blocks where the phantom convoys had been seen. He taped photocopies of the log entries to the corkboard and underlined the initials BT like they were a prayer. I watched him because it felt like watching someone trying to hold a picture steady in a moving car. He was the kind of person who would believe in anything if it gave structure to the noise. As dawn crawled in, the hum subsided a little. The utilities sent a truck with men in orange, and their floodlights were clinical and brute. They called the event widespread failure and said they'd find the source. They had equipment I respected: diagnostic vans, infrared cameras, a man with a tablet and a name. They brought the language of repair. I wanted to believe them. But while they ransacked the grid for rational cause, we kept finding the human cost. A missing persons report in a neighboring precinct listed a man named Roger, a drifter who slept on benches, as last seen walking toward an intersection because someone told him to. The account was terse, bureaucratic, not cruel but not human either.
It read like a ledger. Date, last seen, status. We filed our own notes. We closed some doors and chiseled our rules into the margins of a new binder in thicker ink. We wrote them as a spell against forgetfulness. Rule 1. Walk the building every hour. Rule 2. Never trust the first official explanation. Rule 3. Never answer a personal call during a blackout. Rule 4. If lights attracted, put the lights in your pocket. Those rules were not prophecy. They were a set of survival protocols made by people who had noticed a pattern. They were a preservative, a way to stop the rot of panic. For 2 days the city breathed like a patient with a fever. The utility brought in experts and made pronouncements about localized contamination and transient infractions, and other words that meant someone somewhere had to do the work, and we were, once again, left to hold the patient. People left. They walked toward the places they'd been called to. They left notes in elevators. They left shoes on stair landings.
We found a pair of sneakers under the basement stairs and a child's stuffed animal tucked in between boxes in the recycling room. And then, somewhere in the second night, the noise shifted from being heard to being seen. The cameras caught a thing the patrol car had described in the daylight as an industrial web, a tangle of cable, metal, and chipped concrete that moved like a living coil, clambering along the underside of a collapsed overpass with fingers that could have been roots. It reached, wide-apertured, toward the street lamp, testing light the way a person tests a wound. It moved with a slow patience, and the way it moved around the streetlight made my skin feel the saw teeth of fear. Joey said nothing for a long time. He sat at the corkboard and traced the outline of the tangle with his finger. The photocopies of the old logs looked like a conjuring circle. He whispered, "It knows where the arteries are." I wanted to be a man who closed his palms around the diagram of the city and said, "We will be fine. We will find the breaker. We will patch the fault." That was my old self, the man who believed in blueprints and the comforting math of failure modes. But you can't patch the heart of something that isn't mechanical. The tangle had a weight behind it that made the metal around it rearrange itself in quiet violence. We did the only thing that felt like a direct response. We cut what little rooftop power we controlled. We moved the emergency lights to internal circuits and told residents to draw curtains. We locked the roof hatch and wrapped a chain around the access door like a rosary. The tangle paused at the lip of the overpass and tested the air. For a moment I thought it might just find the warmth of a magnet and coil back into the shadows. Then we heard a voice over the building intercom, impossibly close, a whistle at the end of a child's sentence, a cadence from a neighbor who'd moved away. No one should ever hear someone else's private ghosts over the PA. The voice said a name, exactly the way a person uses a name when they are sure they have you. Joey paled. "Don't go," he said. Rule 3 was not a law written in stone so much as a vein of practice carved into our nights. It wasn't a moral thing, it was a physical one. Answer, and you step toward the light. Step toward the light, and you see cars that vanish, voices that tug, and a tangle that smells like wet metal and rot. That's where I'll leave the first part of this story. The generators hum, the tangle testing the city seams, the log entries like a chorus of warnings, and a list of rules inked into our binder. Joey sat with his maps and his pen, and I sat with a screwdriver and a pocket of fuses. We kept the lights as low as we dared. The blackout wasn't over. The thing under the overpass hadn't left. The calls that sounded like someone's child didn't stop. The city's arteries pulsed with rumors and old warnings, and we were the ones who had to decide whether to listen.
The name over the PA was not my name. It sounded like my name. It was precise in the way a memory is precise. The vowel pulled at the end as if someone were waiting for me to finish a sentence I hadn't started. The voice was thin and clean and impossibly intimate.
For a second, my hands forgot the rhythm of their check, the screwdriver, the fuse holder, the small, disciplined motions I had made 100 times that felt like prayer. The console's LEDs painted my gloves blue and then red and then blue again. Joey's face went white at the same instant mine did. "Don't," he said, but he didn't finish the word. The PA clicked, a static cough, then the voice again. "Dave!" I shut my mouth around a sound like a curse. Rule 3 lived in the binder for a reason. Answering was not curiosity, it was a pull. Whoever or whatever used voices knew the soft places in a person. It knew the voice of a mother, the cadence of a lover, the way a neighbor says your name when they're annoyed. It wouldn't have dignity. It would imitate and knead and open the hand to show you how empty it was. "Cut the roof feed," Joey said, suddenly precise, eyes bright. "Shut it down. If the lights are giving it seams, then—" "I've already isolated it," I lied. I'd only removed one rooftop fuse, put a temporary bridge on the other, so essential circuits could still feed lights for stairways. You learn to lie to yourself in the plant room. It keeps the panic from spreading into the wiring. "Do it," he said. "Now!" I thumbed the breaker for the rooftop and felt the small, satisfying clack of metal finding safety. The floodlights died in a line across the skyline. For a heartbeat, the city above us was a row of dark teeth. On the monitor, a phantom convoy that had been ghosting up 6th dissolved like sugar when light poured on it. Where it had been was a smear of static, then a blank street. The building sighed. It was an ordinary sound, pipes cooling, the diesel bedding down, but in the dark it sounded like a thing trying to remember itself. Then someone banged on a door 3 floors below, a thump like a fist against drywall. Then another, a voice raw with something like hope, shouted, "Roger! Roger, come back!" The name Roger felt like a file I had already opened, the missing drifter from the precinct list. The same syllables had been typed into the ledger a dozen times in a dozen ink hands. The sound was absurdly small, the human in a city whose arteries were closing. Joey pushed himself to his feet so fast his chair screeched. He grabbed a flashlight and the corkboard with its array of dates and photocopies. "If he's out there," he started. "Rule 3, I said. I meant it for both of us. Do not answer personal calls. Stay put. He looked at me as if I had said something holy and wrong all at once. His hand hovered over the photographs. He had the look of a man negotiating with a principal.
He also had a thing I admired, which was the courage to act on what he thought the city needed. "I have to check," he said. He moved toward the stairwell door as if path and conviction were the same thing. "Joey," I began. He didn't answer. The stairwell door clicked behind him, and the fluorescent stairwell light flickered as though someone were testing a filament. He descended into darkness, the beam of his flashlight carving a thin corridor down the stairwell, like a memory being rewritten. You can count a lot of different ways people become heroic. Some people act out of anger. Some people act out of a desire to be seen. Joey acted out of a belief in pattern, like a faith that the map had teeth. He believed the tangle had a geography, and if you could find the seam, you could stitch it. I believed in rules, and rules are clumsy tools, but they keep atoms from scattering. I watched Joey go. The plant room went quiet, in the way a drum goes quiet. It held its last vibration. For a terrible moment, I imagined him stepping out into a street where a blue-lit bus was gliding without weight, and a voice called his childhood nickname. I imagined the tangle's root-like fingers finding the slick of his jacket and drawing him slow as a wound into the underpass. I imagined me, a man who knew systems, left to scrawl instructions into a binder while the city ate men who couldn't resist a call that sounded like love. He reached the lobby and the service elevator door was half open. The light from the elevator throat painted Joey's jaw in a color that made him look older, braver, small.
The elevator's music, soft and ridiculous, bled out into the lobby like someone pouring milk into a bowl. Then the doors shut. The elevator hummed for a long, thin moment, and then stopped between floors, its emergency contact light blinking like the eye of something wary. The PA sighed and delivered another voice, not my mother's this time, but a neighbor's, a woman's laugh cut by static. "They're saying it's safe by the river," she said, in a tone that implied everyone knew something she didn't. I stayed in the plant room because that is what Rule 1 means in practice. You put your boots on the concrete, and you don't allow the building to become a place of improvisation. If Joey went down to the street, fine. If residents started answering calls and stepping into avenues because voices told them to meet people who had been dead a long time, they'd become like the things the logs spoke of, margins in a ledger. I knew the sheets of protocol and where the fuses that mattered lived. I had screwdrivers and a style of patience, but the ledger did not capture the wrongness of a friend pulled away by a voice shaped like a joke. The elevator unstuck with a pop like a cork. Joey was gone. I walked the building then, because it was what I did, because Rule 1 is not a suggestion. Boots on the concrete. I moved through corridors that smelled of burnt coffee and bleach.
Doors stood open in a slow rhythm, like someone had been interrupted mid-gesture. On the second-floor landing, a toddler's blanket lay draped over the railing. The kid was nowhere in sight. A phone lay face down on the carpet, with messages blinking in the dark. I pried it open with a key, and the lock screen showed a call from Mom with a timestamp that had blur and meaning. I crushed thumbnails into the stairwell's emergency switch and locked it down like one shuts a mouth. If someone was out in the street following a voice, there was nothing I could do that would bring them back. You tell yourself this so you can move on, and the next motion will not be weighted with grief. The tangle, whenever it mattered, did not always appear fully. Most of its work was done through implication, a stretch of collapsed overpass with long metal fingers that were more a rearrangement of city refuse than a complete organism. A great coil of power line and cable that hung like vegetable matter and shifted with impossible deliberation. But now, on the monitor, the underside of the overpass was visible in a feed we'd patched together from a neighbor's weather cam. The tangle was out of the gutter and across the pavement like a drag of something that didn't belong on asphalt. It smelled on the feed, if a smell can travel as data. It hung in my teeth like greasy smoke. They pushed into the light to test it, the way a pest tests a trap. We saw one of the phantom buses approach a low bridge and the shadow of the tangle lift to meet it. The blue interiors of the bus glowed, and inside were silhouettes of people with heads tipped toward the windows in a way that made it look like they were listening to a sermon. When a utility truck swung a spotlight on them, the blue collapsed into nothing. The bus folded open like tissue and was gone. We cut our rooftop window lights and let our stairwell glow be a small island. I wired signs that said "Stay inside" in big black letters and tacked them to the stairwell doors. I posted notes telling residents to leave a light on near family photos if they wanted something to hold on to in the dark. 2 nights in, the pattern became mechanical in the ugliest way. People left. Sometimes they left because a voice said their name. Sometimes they left because the weight of hunger and fear and the desire to be with someone who might help them grew larger than the rules. We found the oddest artifacts, half a sandwich outside the baker's, a photograph pinned to a lamppost, a child's drawing wedged in the spokes of a bicycle. The city became a place where gestures were severed in mid-movement.
On the third night, with the tangle testing the overpass like a mouth assessing a new tooth, the true decision came down to the age-old trade-off between the small safety of one roof and the grim calculus of many souls on the street. A group of young men gathered near the intersection where the tangle's shadow fell.
They had flashlights and a sort of bravado you see when people try to be courageous in packs. Someone had posted a live stream of it, and the comments were a carnival. "Look at this. They're gonna mess with it. Leave them alone." My chest tightened like the hand of someone squeezing a throat. The thing with the tangle is this: it learned, and learning looks like pattern. It circled the lights. It found seams in the city where people were soft, out of habit, out of memory, and it played them like a reed instrument until someone followed the tune. If it couldn't coax people, it would mimic voices to lure them. If light threatened it, it recoiled. If a human stepped into its grasp, the human was not always returned. The patrol car came and stopped on the far corner, light bar a dull strobe. A cop stepped out and aimed his flashlight like a spear. The tangle wrapped around a lamppost and drew the post down in a slow rot. Sparks flew like small dark stars. A man called to the group in a soothing voice, "If you hear something that sounds like someone you love, do not go. Stay where you are." He sounded like he had been saying it all his life. Joey was standing on the roof of a delivery van near the curb, waving his flashlight and shouting into the dark as if he could be heard by the city. He had a bullhorn, one of those cheesy things from a community center, strapped under his arm. From my angle, I could see his hands were shaking. He looked like someone balancing a flame on an outstretched palm. "Don't shine up!" I shouted. My voice sounded thin and small across the distance, like trying to throw a rope into a storm. He looked at me, and for a moment the shouting stopped, and he mouthed something. I couldn't make it out. Then a voice cut through the dark so cleanly it nearly made me think of the ocean. "Joey, there's a way. Come by the old tracks. Come home." His jaw clenched, and he stepped down from the van. People around him laughed in a way that sounded like boiling water. I watched him go toward the curb, toward the place where the tangle had knuckled the gutter. The city's breath fogged out in front of us like a white curtain. I ran. I ran through stairwells 3 at a time. The plant room door banged behind me, as if the building were trying to force me back into my job. I hit the street, and the cold air grabbed my sweat. Joey's bullhorn was thin in his hands. 2 men were pulling him back, and he wrenched free as if memory mattered more than flesh. "Don't!" I tried again. He looked at me like he was sorry and brave all at once. "If it calls you, it means to take you," I said. It was a thing I had told myself in the gray hours. It was a thing the binder had told us, the scribbled lines from decades ago. He laughed in a way that wasn't a laugh. "What if this is our only way to learn it? What if we can map it?" he cried. "You always want a map, Dave. You always want numbers." He was right.
The man who loved load curves and duty also loved the illusion that every unknown could be made small with stats and cause. Joey wanted to drag the tangle into daylight and take its picture. He wanted to name it the way a child names a storm. "You can't map an appetite," I said. "You can only keep the doors closed while it eats." A woman across the street answered a phone and started to walk. Her steps were slow and beautiful, like someone tracing a map under the soles of their shoes. Her husband chased her down the block and hauled her back. She cried like someone whose grief is lit from the inside. Then it happened. The tangle struck out. It did not lurch with speed. It moved like a thought. A mass of cable and rebar slid down from the overpass, its tendrils unspooling like vines. The first tendril wrapped around the hood of a car and lifted, not with brute force, but with a corrosive insistence. The car's doors popped open like a hinge being forced into truth. Inside, the seats were empty. The tendril tapped the steering wheel like a knocker. The car's radio, which had been strangely alive with static, clicked to a station playing a recorded voice. "We miss you. Come home."
A man stepped forward as if the sound had teeth. He moved toward the car. For a second I saw the expression on his face, and it was not fear. It was the look of a person who had been visited by memory and accepted the visit as salvation. I should have moved then. I should have shouted at the man. Instead, I watched, and the thing that watched me was the reflection of my own damnable curiosity. If you have ever waited for the moment a wound opens, half afraid you will be released and half afraid you will rot, you will know what I felt. I am not proud of it. Joey moved to intercept. He stepped between the man and the hood. In my memory, he held up his bullhorn like a talisman. He shouted something about mapping and patterns and the need to learn. The tangle's tendril twitched and plucked like a string. His voice was taken like a note. It sounded like a laugh first, short, a sound that made the street tilt, and then his name in molasses. Joey, it said, and he stepped toward it, because for a man with a map, the idea of a place that could not be charted is unbearable. His hand brushed the tendril like a nectar. The tendril closed around his wrist like a vice. He looked at me over his shoulder. For a single second, the light from a cracked street lamp lit his face, and I saw the man who, in quiet times, had made maps and shared sandwiches with me in the plant room. He smiled as if the smile had been given to him by the past and by an understanding he had chosen over his life. Go back, lock the doors, write the rules. His voice was the same tone I used to use to tell tenants to keep refrigerators closed. He had not been dragged so much as led into a decision. The tendril pulled him toward the underside of the overpass with a calm that made the sidewalk look like something you step off by mistake. His bullhorn clattered and skittered across the pavement and fell still. The men's hands braced and slipped as if trying to hold someone under a tide. The man whose car had been touched fell to his knees and pressed his forehead to the asphalt as if to pray. I did not run into the tangle. I did not answer the voice that came from it and sounded like my sister calling for something she had never had. I didn't because of Rule 3 in my head, and because the binder in my pocket felt like a promise between people. I moved instead to do the one thing I had the power to do. I climbed a streetlight pole, my fingers numb and shaky, and I reached for the junction box that fed the overpass's lamps. The tangle tested the light with a titanic patience. It was like trying to pinch a sliver of sun out of the sky. "Dave!" someone screamed behind me. I looked down and saw a young cop pointing a flashlight like a blade. "What are you doing?" I yelled back. The words felt absurdly technical in that crack of primal fear. "I have to." The junction box's lid was warm with electricity that hummed like bees. I took a wrench from my belt and felt its vibration in my palm. People around looked like beached things. Joey's wrist was wrapped in the tangle, the cord coiling like a snake harvesting for itself. He had partially disappeared. One leg, then his torso, then the hitch of his jaw. He laughed, or perhaps it was just the sound the wire made. A voice came out of the tendril and said in 100 languages I knew and didn't know, "Come, come home." I thought about running. The thing to understand about those decisions is that there's always a pressure like gravity. The mind wants to be merciful. It wants to close the loop. It wants to hand over the person it loves in exchange for silence. The city had ribs that night, and the tangle slid like a hand between them. I gave my hand to the right bolt and tightened. Power flickered, and the junction box spat sparks like a small, brief constellation. The light hummed and then died with the kind of definitive silence that makes a person feel their place in the universe. For a second, the street was a velvet absence. In the dark, the tangle recoiled. It did not scream. It did not rage. It was offended, perhaps. It regrouped like something that had lost a taste. Joey, who had been half inside a world he thought he could read, sagged to the pavement like a rope cut through the air.
The tangle twined back under the overpass and retreated into its gutters. Streetlights blinked uncertainly, then came back with a softer, tremulous glow. I climbed down from the pole with legs that trembled like someone who'd been away from warm water for too long. Joey lay on the asphalt, and his breathing was a thing I had to listen to as if it were music that might stop.
He lived, and he lived in a way that made the air in my chest ache with relief and guilt in equal measures. The paramedics came and took him away, not as someone saved, but as someone who had been unstitched and remade by a night. His wrist was bruised, and the skin had a smell that later would make me sit up in bed, because memory has teeth. He didn't speak at length in the ambulance. He only squeezed my hand once and looked at me with an expression that was not triumph and not regret, something more complicated. The satisfaction of a man who had gone out to test a map and found a seam he could not stitch. "They'll make his ankles into a story," a cop said softly when Joey's shoulders were being lifted. "He'll be in a report." "Like all the others," I answered. Over the following days, the city began to stitch itself back together, the way you stitch a torn hem, not neat, but serviceable. The utility crews did their work with the efficiency of those who have a vocation for undoing chaos. They replaced transformers, tightened lines, and published statements about unprecedented stressors to distribution networks and isolated underground fires. The official narrative favored equipment failure and routine human error. Where the logs had entries with the terse initials BT, the public-facing reports used terms like anomalous site activity and unrelated missing person incidents. No one in authority used the binder language. They did not call anything a tangle. They called it an incident. But the binder does not disappear. The binder is sticky like old paper, and it keeps the handwriting of men who have had to make rules out of fear. In the weeks after, we patched the corkboard with new copies of the logs. Staff from other buildings called in to ask our procedure because a crew 5 blocks over had also cut their rooftop lights and saved their residents from being drawn into the street. There was a strange solidarity among night people, as if we shared a secret that people in office towers who went home at 6 could not understand. Some residents left the building. Some never returned. We found a woman's tote bag, the letters of her name frayed at the strap, in a neighbor's unit. A pair of glasses with a gold rim was left on a landing like an offering. Occasional notes were taped to mailboxes. Gone to river, met at 3rd, do not come, and their handwriting was the same handwriting that appears when grief writes itself in a hurry. Joey came back to work after a week. He moved slower. He did not talk about his time under the overpass, not in any way that made sense. He had a small scar on his wrist, shaped like the impression of braid. When he drew his maps, his lines trembled in a way they hadn't before. He insisted we collect the reports and staple them into new binders, and he insisted we make photocopies and mail them to other managers.
He believed fervently that a pattern could be found, and he wanted to make the pattern legible to someone who still cared to look. I changed in the less obvious ways. I stopped thinking of the job as a ledger. I began to think of it as a stewardship. Money still mattered in the practical sense. You could not pay diesel with good intentions, but it shrank in my ledger. I kept thinking about the look on Joey's face when the tangle took him and the odd calm that had come over him. He had not been afraid. He had gone because he thought he could make the city tell its secret if he forced it into daylight. The binder grew. We added a makeshift index at the back and titled it in a messy block, Night Shift Protocols. We rewrote Rule 2 to include more than suspicion. Never trust the first official explanation. Archive everything.
We added notes in margins indicating coordinates where phantom vehicles had been sighted and times. The old entries from the 70s and the 90s and 2010 slotted neatly into a rhythm that was more terrifying than any single incident, a periodicity. The incidents followed the city like a tide, long, slow intervals, and then a sudden swell and a handful lost to the seam. In early morning shifts now, I still walk the building. Rule 1 is a muscle memory. In winter, the diesel smells like burnt sugar and ice, and I think about the way a machine lives and what it means to be the one who tends it. The plant room light is a small constant in a city that forgets the names of its own arteries. I keep a small, dedicated drawer with spare fuses and photocopies of the oldest logs. On the inside cover of the binder, in block letters, I added an aside I'd not seen in older notes. Teach the new night hand Rule 3 before you teach them the console. People ask what changed me. They expect something grand, a vow, a renunciation, a trip abroad to count the stars. The truth is more domestic. I started leaving my keys on the counter in the morning and sitting at the coffee shop across the street for an hour after I clocked out. I began answering the phone less as if by accident and more as an act of discipline. I wrote letters to people I had let slip out of sight. I paid attention to small things, a neighbor's laugh in the corridor, the way a boiler coughs on a bitter morning. The blackout had sharpened the edges of my life until what had been background became a foreground of concern. Joey left town a few months later with a backpack and a pile of photocopied logs under his arm. He said he was going to trace the pattern across the neighborhoods where incidents had clustered. He wanted to measure the intervals, to put a grid over the city's bones and see if the tangle had a map. I watched him go and felt a drop in my chest like a removed tooth. Before he left, he handed me a small spiral-bound notebook. The cover was frayed, and the first page was already filled with his cramped, urgent writing.
"For when I'm gone," he said, and for once he didn't crack a joke about patterns. "Keep it. Add to it. I keep it now. It sits under the binder, and when I feel the city pressing on me, I open to a page and read about an outage in 1984, where someone wrote, 'Voices in stairwell, one resident left to join them.' I think about the ways men write to each other across time. They don't say 'beware' with melodrama. They say it with the curt economy of the practical. Lock the doors, don't answer, trip feed. In those pages, you can read the language of people who have been tasked with keeping the lights on while the rest of the city sleeps. I am still pragmatic. I still like my graphs and my blueprints and the idea that a problem can be solved by the right series of steps. But the blackout taught me an additional thing, that some phenomena do not yield to tidy remedies. They wave like a hand at the edge of the map and call your name in the accent of a childhood kitchen. Sometimes survival is not about fixing the machine. Sometimes survival is about learning how to choose who you will keep and who you will let go. There is a cost to the keeping. Every rule is written out of the grief of people who have had to trade freedom for safety. We tell the tenants to keep curtains drawn and to rely on emergency lighting. We instruct new hands on how to isolate rooftop feeds and where to post notes about stairwell usage. We tell them to walk the building every hour so the floors don't belong to the dark. We tell them to never accept the first explanation because official language tends to smooth edges until the truth has no teeth. We remind them to treat a phone call that sounds like home as if it were a baited hook. The periodicity remains. In the weeks when the city seems well-fed and the power draw is within expected variance, the binder doesn't speak. But once every year or 3, depending on a pattern I've not yet learned to predict, a cluster of reports rolls in and the old sheaf of notes flutters open like a palm.
The utility sends men in orange shirts, and they smile their polite, well-trained smiles and ask about voltage spikes and transformer loads. They thank us and leave. We go back to walking the building and cleaning the grit from the generator intakes. We do what we can. Sometimes I think about Joey out on the road with his maps, chasing a pattern like a man chasing a comet. I think about the night he stepped toward something he'd believed he could name, and the way the tangle had accepted him, or nearly accepted him, and spat him back like a thing disentangling a swallowed object. I think about the men whose names are typed into police reports with a disposition of left voluntarily. Their voices sit in the margins of the binder like small prayer strokes. I think about the patience of machines and the appetite of things that are wilder. People ask if I believe it's supernatural.
They want a label to pin to the chest of events so they can move on. I tell them, I don't know. It would be easier if I said no and laid out a schematic of broken insulators and opportunistic rodents. It would be easier if I said yes and invoked demons and propitiatory ritual. The honesty is that the city did something it does not usually do. It invited people to walk into the gutters. Some of those invitations were carried on voices that remembered you. Some were carried on the sight of a phantom vehicle that dissolved when light was applied. The only thing that made a difference was the stubborn application of a few rules written by people who'd been around long enough to see the pattern repeat. If there is a single practical change in me, it is this. I no longer take the stability of the city's hum for granted. I sleep with the plant room key under my pillow sometimes, in a small, ritualized way. I no longer accept a single explanation when three are possible. And when a phone rings in the dead of night with a voice that says my name like a pastry, I let it ring. At the back of the binder, I wrote, slowly and with a hand that still trembles when I recall the tangle, a closing set of rules that a new night technician could read if they ever found themselves alone with the diesel and the monitors and the small peculiar terrors that visit a city when its arteries falter. Rule 1. Walk the building every hour. Confirm with your boots, not just the sensors. Sensors lie in neat numbers. The pavement tells the truth. Rule 2. Never trust the first official explanation. Archive every report, every scrap of paper. Patterns are ghosts that need company. Rule 3. Never answer a personal call during a blackout. If it sounds like someone you love, it is trying to move you. Rule 4. If lights attract it, put the lights in your pocket. There is a time when illumination is safety and a time when illumination is a sign you have been noticed. And I added one more, something no one had written with those blunt initials. Rule 5. Keep each other honest. If someone wants to test the seam, stop them with a hand and a binder page and an ugly scolding. Some maps aren't meant to be followed. The binder sits now in the plant room on the same shelf the generator's manual occupies. New hands stop by to read it in the warm light of afternoon, thinking it a quaint relic. I watch them because there is a responsibility in knowing and not telling. It is a peculiar pleasure to be the one to pass on the rules. Passing them is not heroic. It is maintenance. It is a small, stubborn attempt to keep the city as a place where people can make dinner without being lured into the street by the voice of a memory. I survived the city blackout. I pay taxes and fix starter motors and write incident reports that don't capture the fullness of the night. The pay stub is a narrow thing compared to what the blackout gave and what it took.
It taught me the geometry of fear and the economy of ritual. It taught me that compassion can be a form of containment, hard, ugly, necessary, and that survival sometimes demands the unromantic work of locking doors. If you want more long, true-feeling stories like this, stories that live on the border between what can be explained and what can only be remembered, follow along and check the description for the fuller copies of the logs we photocopied. The binder is a small thing. The city's memory is larger. Keep your lights low
and your boots steady. And if you somehow find yourself in a dark street and you hear a voice calling your name, hold fast to whatever rules you have. Hold fast for the people who could not. Hold fast because surviving the blackout changed me in ways small and sharp. It made me careful. It made me keep lists. It made me write rules. It made me a keeper. I survive by walking the building every hour, by reading the logs, and by keeping the lights in my pocket when the city learns to sing again.